Just before the break, we were talking about the importance of people understanding what you say. And that means you need to adjust your language. And you need to be aware of your strengths and your weaknesses. So when you're talking to a lecture hall of university students who are very, very well educated, you're going to talk in a certain way. When you're talking to a general audience, you're going to talk in a certain way. For example, this series that we're doing here, there are many, many people watching this from the brothers and sisters who are very highly educated. There are people who are at a medium level. There are people who don't have any formal education at all. There are people whose English is extremely fluent. There are people whose English is of a good level. There are people who perhaps only know a little bit of English. So we have to try and keep the speech general and try to keep it as much as possible. And we ask Allah to make that easy, as much as possible in a way that it hits everybody, or at least it gets the majority of people. And if you're on the street corner talking to people who speak in a very slang way, they have certain terms and terminology, within a respectable limit, because you always want to present yourself in a respectable way, speak to them in the way that they know. And every prophet came with the language of his people. And I'll tell you a story about some of our scholars in Saudi Arabia. One of the things that used to surprise me is that in many of the khutbahs that were delivered, some of the khatibs would speak very poetically. They would speak so poetically that I struggled to follow what they were saying. Even though at that time my Arabic was fluent, I struggled to follow what they were saying because they would speak in poetry throughout the whole khutbah. And one of the shuyukh, he told me about one of his shuyukh. And if I'm not mistaken, he lived in Riyadh. And he used to deliver the khutbah in the slang language of the people. Not in a really bad slang, like swearing or bad speech, but he would deliver the speech in a way people understood. Looking at the masjid, when the masjid is full of people who maybe they have not such a good grasp of the language, some of them have learned the language as a second language, some of them have only learned street words. You want them to benefit from the khutbah. And sometimes speaking in poetry and balagha and eloquence as though you're competing in a poetry contest means that only a very few group of people can understand. And if you look at the speech of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we're going to perhaps look at this later on, you see that his speech was eloquent, but it was easy to understand. You don't listen to something the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said and think, I don't understand that. Even when you have a reasonable level of Arabic, it's very easy to understand. And this we all extract from the statement of Musa, وَحْلُلْ عُقْدَةً مِّن لِسَانِي يَفْقَهُ قَوْلِي, that they may understand what I say. So we do need to adapt our method and to speak to the people in a way that they understand. And appoint for me a helper from my family, Harun, my brother, increase my strength with him and let him share my task of prophethood, that we may glorify you much and remember you much. The greatest dua a brother has ever made for his brother is the dua that Musa made for Harun, that Allah Azza wa Jal share the task of prophethood with Harun. But what I want to draw your attention to is the statement, كَيْ نُسَبِّحَكَ كَثِيرًا وَنَذْكُرَكَ كَثِيرًا. And this leads us to the understanding of part of the methodology of the prophets in da'wah, that we may glorify you much and remember you much. That the da'iyah is the one who remembers Allah, and the da'iyah is the one who calls to Allah. The da'iyah, the one who gives da'wah, is the one who is the strongest in worship. And one of the saddest things that we see in this day and age, that we can understand from this story of Musa, is that we see du'at who don't implement Islam. And they don't worship Allah as He deserves to be worshipped. May Allah Azza wa Jal correct our affairs and make us from those who remember Him much and glorify Him much. How sad is it to think that you are going out there to call the people to Islam, and you're so deficient in your worship that you don't even pray some of the voluntary prayers, or you miss the most important prayers, or you compromise in your da'wah by doing things that are haram, or you go out to the people in a way that is haram. Like the brother who goes out having shaved his beard and says, "Oh, my people, enter into Islam." One of the methodology of the prophets in da'wah, or part of the methodology of the prophets in da'wah, is that the prophets were the most people to worship Allah, and the furthest of the people away from disobeying Allah. We are human beings and we make mistakes. And I'm not saying for a second that I sit here without sins. Rather, I sit here with more sins than you sit there at home with. And I firmly believe that. But I'm sitting here to say that you strive your best to worship Allah. And don't allow the shaitan to get to you in a certain way, where the shaitan says to you, "Go and do da'wah, go and do da'wah, go and do da'wah." And you miss your prayers, and you miss your remembrance of Allah, and you don't make dua, and you don't do those individual acts of worship. Look at the worship of the Prophet ﷺ, that he would worship until his feet became swollen, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. And the Sahaba said to him about this, "Your previous and future sins have been forgiven by Allah. Why would you worship until your feet are swollen?" The Prophet ﷺ said, "أَفَلَا أَكُونَ عَبْدًا شَكُورًا." Should I not be a grateful slave? Show gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Remember Allah much. Don't let the shaitan put you into da'wah instead of your individual worship. Rather, do your individual worship and da'wah. And it's not from the methodology of the prophets to abandon the individual worship of Allah for the sake of da'wah. Rather, they would balance the two. And da'wah is better than individual worship when it is done in addition to the individual worship. But when it's done to the exclusion of the individual worship, then it's not better. So pray your prayers, worship Allah, pray the voluntary prayers, pray the night prayer if you can. May Allah Azza wa Jal make you and I from those who are able to stand praying to Him at night. Make dua to Him, remember Him much. Do as many of the individual acts of worship as you can, and call the people. And this has so much barakah in your da'wah. So much barakah. Because you are a person who the people see your worship of Allah. They look at you and they see you worshipping Allah. What did Aisha say about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? كَانَ خُلُقُهُ الْقُرْآنِ. His manners, his etiquettes were the Qur'an. You looked at him and you saw the Qur'an being implemented. And that's how the da'iyah should be. Somebody giving da'wah, you look at them and you see them worshipping Allah. And you see them turning to Allah, and you see them praying, and you see them remembering Allah. And then when they tell you to do the same, your heart is open to it. As for when the person comes who is a worse liar than you and a greater cheat than you, and he comes disobeying Allah openly, or she comes disobeying Allah openly, and then comes and says, worship Allah, become Muslim, turn to Islam, this doesn't have the same feeling in the heart of the person. And then I want to turn your attention to the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal to Musa and Harun in ayah number 43. اذهبا إلى فرعون إنه طغى فقولا له قولا لينا لعله يتذكر أو يخشى. From the major methodology of the prophets in da'wah, from the story of Musa, is to deal with people softly. The Prophet ﷺ was told in the Qur'an, فَبِمَا رَحْمَةٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ لِنْتَ لَهُمْ وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَضًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ لَانْفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ. For by a mercy of Allah you are soft with them. And if you are hard and harsh-hearted, they would have run from around you. Fir'aun, the worst of the tugha, the worst of the tyrants, and the worst of the people, Fir'aun, who transgressed that limit. And Allah said, فَقُولَا لَهُ قَوْلًا لَيِّنًا. Speak to him in a soft way. And the essence of your da'wah and the original principle of your da'wah is to be soft and kind and gentle in speech. And there are times when you will be a little stronger in speech and a little harsher, but these are not the basis of your da'wah. These are the exception rather than the rule. And hikmah or wisdom is knowing when to use both. But the origin and the basis and the standard and the methodology of the prophets in da'wah is to be soft. A man came to one of the khulafa and he began to speak to him in a harsh way and admonish him. And the Khalifa said to him, I am not worse than Fir'aun, and you are not better than Musa. And what an excellent statement this was. I'm not worse than Fir'aun, and you're not better than Musa. And if Musa, from the best of the prophets, was commanded to speak softly to Fir'aun from the worst of mankind, then our basis and our methodology in da'wah is soft speech and a gentle approach. And the only time we move away from that is when there is a necessary exception which is dictated by wisdom that you are blessed with, and may Allah Azza wa Jal bless us with that. And that's all we have time for. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
The same